Today is February 10th. It's the 41st day of the year. This is the On This Day podcast. If you've been listening from the start, some of this may sound a little familiar, and if you haven't, it'll all be new to you. Either way, enjoy the show. In 1985, Garry Kasparov is the youngest undisputed world chess champion in the world. That year, he plays chess against 32 different computers and wins all of the games. 4 years later, in 1989, he again competes against a computer and easily defeats the computer named Deep Thought, built by Carnegie Mellon and IBM. IBM gets to work on a new machine with which to defeat the world champion. They call the machine Deep Blue. By 1996, Kasparov has been the undefeated world chess champion for 11 years. But when Kasparov plays against Deep Blue in Philadelphia on this day in 1996, he is defeated. This is the first time a chess-playing computer has won a game against an undisputed world champion. It's the first game of the 6-game match, which is played under normal tournament time controls, and Kasparov wins the match 7 days later, 4-2. But the paradigm has shifted. A little over a year later, there's a rematch in New York. The rules are a little different this time. Deep Blue programmers are allowed to make adjustments to the computer in between games, and the computer is set up in a separate room. So when Kasparov sees deep intelligence in the computer's moves in the second game, he suspects a human may be controlling Deep Blue during gameplay. IBM, of course, denies this. Deep Blue defeats Kasparov in the 1997 rematch 3.5 to 2.5. The first time a computer defeats a world champion in match play. Alexander Pushkin descends from Russian nobility. The Moscow-born Pushkin publishes his first poem in 1814 at the age of 15, and it is the first of many. Pushkin writes poems about revolution and social reform, as well as romance and love. His work is radical, and at one point, the Tsar wants to banish him to Siberia, outraged that Pushkin has, quote, flooded Russia with scandalous poems. All the youth is reading it. His friends intervene and convince the Tsar to instead exile him to the south, where Pushkin writes romantic odes to a number of married women he takes as lovers. While in exile, he also writes the play Boris Godunov in 1825, a satire about the Russian Tsar of the same name who ruled Russia over 200 years prior. The play is censored and not allowed to be performed until 45 years later, and then only a censored version is put up. The full original version of Pushkin's play is not performed in Russia until 2007. But getting back to 19th century Russia, with his work, Pushkin is creating a new language of Russian literature. In 1827, he's allowed to emerge from exile, and a year later, he's introduced to Natalia Goncharova. Natalia is 16 when Pushkin meets her. She is young and beautiful and has many suitors. They marry 4 years later in 1831, and a few years after that, they meet a French military officer named Georges Dant, who is quite taken with the flirtatious Natalia, much to Pushkin's chagrin. George marries Natalia's sister in early 1837, some suggesting that the marriage is a sham, a diversion to avert attention away from the affair that George is having with Natalia. True or not, Pushkin is enraged by the rumors. Pushkin challenges George to a duel. On a winter evening in the woods of the Black River area of St. Petersburg, George fires first, hitting Pushkin in the abdomen and dropping him to the ground. Pushkin manages to pull himself up and returns fire, hitting George in the arm, but it's merely a flesh wound. Pushkin's wound, on the other hand, is mortal. Alexander Pushkin has firmly established his place in the history of Russian poetry and prose, cultivating the language and techniques that are the cornerstones of modern Russian literature. He suffers for 2 days before succumbing to his stomach wound on this day in 1837. And also passing away on this day in 2014, Shirley Temple Black. Shirley Temple is born in Santa Monica, California in 1928. Like all little girls, she likes to sing and dance. But by the time she is 6 years old, she is an international movie star. She's already appeared in a dozen feature films and even more short films by the time the 1934 film Bright Eyes, written to showcase her talents, is released, putting her front and center on the world stage. The film includes a performance of what will become her signature song, On the Good Ship Lollipop. Temple's films in the 1930s are hugely successful, and she churns them out at a good clip. She becomes a symbol of hope during the Depression era, playing characters who can melt the cold heart of a wealthy miser with just a smile, or lift the spirits of a down-on-his-luck hobo with a small show of compassion. And in a way, she serves the country by giving Americans something to be happy about, even if just for a few hours. President Roosevelt comments on Temple's contribution, saying, quote, "It's a splendid thing that for just 15 cents, an American can go to a movie and look up at the smiling face of a baby and forget his troubles." By 1940, the shadow of war looms, and Temple, now 12 years old and on the cusp of her teen years, she sees her popularity begin to wane. Her parents buy out the remainder of her contract, and she goes to school like a normal kid for the first time. Over the next 10 years, she performs in a few more films, gets married at the age of 17, has a daughter, and then gets divorced, and then marries again, this time to Charles Alden Black, and retires from the film business altogether in 1950, when she is 22 years old. In the 1950s and 60s, Shirley Temple Black hosts a few TV shows before turning to politics, running for a congressional seat in 1967. She loses her bid for Congress, but shortly thereafter, she's asked to represent the United States at the UN General Assembly in 1969, and she is once again the face of her country on the world stage. In 1974, Temple Black is appointed ambassador to Ghana, then serves in the position of Chief Protocol of the United States in 1976, advising the President, Vice President, and Secretary of State on international diplomatic protocol. And in 1989, she is appointed ambassador to Czechoslovakia. After a long, varied, illustrious, and accomplished career, Shirley Temple Black passes away of natural causes on this day in 2014 at the age of 85. There are 324 days left in the year.